that is obviously where we take a huge sidestep away from kind of the similarities of manufacturing and really get into the cannabis space. And that to me, again, that's really what interested me about this business because it is so intricate and I'm a details person. It's just so intricate. You really have to dot every I, cross every T, and run it through 12 spell checks.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our #1 priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. Cannabis has become a booming industry, with several states legalizing the use of cannabis in their states. And the industry is also becoming complex with the ever-increasing applications of cannabis products and their byproducts. The companies need to comply with the state requirements, but there might also be additional process overheads due to federal limitations. While the cannabis industry has some similarities with other industries, such as manufacturing, food, or tobacco, there are also significant differences due to the unique traceability and processing requirements. In today's episode, our guest, Dave Crysler, shares his insights into the nuances of the cannabis market and its value chain. He also discusses the customer groups of each of the players involved in the industry and their licensing structure. Finally, he discusses the manufacturing, warehousing, and inventory processes of the cannabis companies and their compliance requirements. Let me introduce Dave to you. Dave is the founder of the Crysler Club and host of the Everyday Business Problems podcast. Having spent nearly 20 years working for a publicly traded corporation that grew through acquisition, provided Dave with the opportunity to grow several different businesses during his career. Entering entrepreneurship, Dave quickly realized there was a tremendous need within small businesses to have access to the tools and support that were commonplace in a large corporation. It was during this time Dave developed his operations framework that he uses to solve everyday problems and free business owners from working in their business so it can grow. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam. Excited to be here and join you for this great conversation.
And I am super excited to have you as well. Obviously, you have tons and tons of experience and insights in the cannabis world. And that world is super complex if you think from the operational perspective, from the process perspective. So it's going to be so exciting to dig into all of those details. Just to kick things off, Dave, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus these days?
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks. So, as Sam already covered, my name is Dave Crysler, and I own a business consulting company called the Crysler Club. And I started out in a family-run business. My parents still own multiple businesses today. And throughout that time, I had gone to work for my parents and also kind of always aspired to have a much larger role. And I ended up finding myself working for a large publicly traded corporation that grew through acquisition. And that was really the time that I spent growing, learning what it was like to run an operation, what it was like to implement different systems, do continuous improvement projects. And throughout that time, I had always aspired to kind of come back and own my own business, which I was fortunate enough to now do. And really the connection for me into the cannabis space after spending, more than 20 years in the manufacturing space is really all about the similarities between the cannabis industry and the manufacturing industry. There is a tremendous crossover in terms of an operational need from a systems perspective as well. And the other thing that has really always attracted me to the cannabis industry is the fact that there's so many just down to earth people in that industry.
Yeah.
It again really resonates for me in terms of growing up in that kind of family run business and obviously working in manufacturing for a significant portion of my career. And so I found a niche there helping these business owners, these entrepreneurs that are just getting started in the cultivation and growing, as well as the lab testing space, to help them identify and also be able to document the processes needed to achieve compliance from a regulatory standpoint. Because again, that's another complexity, Sam, that you mentioned about the cannabis industry specifically. That's
Yeah.
another layer of complexity that we didn't have in the manufacturing space. But because of that complexity, you have to be ultra concise and clear when it comes to your process documentation and your system implementation and how those systems and processes work to continually achieve regulatory compliance.
Okay, amazing. And I'm super excited to dig into all of that. But before that, we have one of the standard questions for all of our guests. And that is going to be, Dave, your perspective on business growth. What does growth mean to you, Dave?
Yeah, so, growth means to me building an operation that is sustainable.
Okay.
For, the most important part is sustainability, because if you don't have an operation that you can sustain, you're never going to be able to grow it.
Yep.
And, part of that is having the infrastructure in place. I use that word pretty literally and specifically because
Yeah.
infrastructure to me is all about having, the right planning, the right people, the right processes, and the right, programs or automations to tie everything together. So it's
Yeah.
kind of the four pillars that we utilize when we talk about infrastructure within business. And so you've got that sustainability factor. On top of that, you are, for most business owners, you are trying to get to the point that you're able to grow and scale. And that can mean different things for different people based on the type of business you're operating. If you're operating more of a lifestyle business versus, a value-based business. And that connects to my third kind of component of that, which is the sellability.
Yeah.
And as I tell people, when you define what success looks like for you, and it is different for everybody, there is no right answer, no wrong answer. And that's the differentiator between lifestyle business and a value-based business that you want to exit one day. And I tell people there is nothing wrong with operating and owning a lifestyle business as long as you recognize that that's what you are doing, that you
Exactly.
still have infrastructure in place, because unfortunately, we are going to exit our businesses one way or the other.
Yep.
And so even in a lifestyle business, you want to be giving some consideration to what that exit looks like and having infrastructure in place that the business does not still completely consume yourself. You are not a operator owner. You are still an owner of a lifestyle business, and you have that infrastructure in place to ultimately help you grow your lifestyle, and or if you're operating a value-based business, to grow that business to an exit at some point.
Okay, amazing perspective there. So now let's dig into the cannabis space. I think I'm super excited to dig into that because not a lot of people are going to be familiar with how the cannabis industry is really structured. So even though you talk about similarity, in my mind, I have done a lot of business, let's say in the alcohol industry or the tobacco industry, and those industries could be significantly different when it comes to the manufacturing or the operational processes, just because of the overhead that they typically get because of the unique processes. And obviously, cannabis is in my mind, obviously, you have the similarity, but the differences is what is going to make the difference for the business, because those differences are going to have the real overhead for the business. So let's talk about some of the players. And you mentioned, let's say the lab testing, you have the growers. So why don't you give us the entire value chain in the cannabis industry, which are going to be the industries or the companies that are going to be involved in the entire value chain?
Yeah, I mean, it's even interesting, that question just by itself, Sam, because as you kind of look at cannabis from a macro level,
Yeah.
you have cannabis, you have the CDB space as well. And from a macro kind of regulatory perspective, certain states have legalized medical marijuana. Certain states have legalized
Yeah.
recreational use as well. Some states are CBD only,
Yeah.
and some states remain fully illegal. So it is really interesting at the macro level to kind of look at that. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because the other thing that has changed in terms of the supply chain is the terminology with that. And certain states utilize different terminology.
Yeah.
But at a basic high level, you've got a grower or cultivator.
Yeah.
You are going to have, lab testing facilities. You're going to have dispensaries and or provision centers, they are now called in many states.
Yeah.
You're also going to have delivery along with that, or distribution,
Yeah.
again, depending on kind of the terminology that the states are using. So I personally, I focus more in the grower cultivation and
Okay.
lab testing spaces.
Yeah.
And for me, that's pretty specific. Dispensaries, delivery, that is going to be more on the retail side. So you've
Okay.
got, that's the easiest way to think of it. That is really the customer facing retail component. It's very similar to a typical shopping experience, a typical retail shopping experience, B2C, if you will.
Yeah.
And I am more in the B2B space. So for me personally, that crossover in terms of, kind of similarity between, manufacturing and cannabis really fits well into the cultivation grower space as well as the lab testing, because both of them, all of them require compliance. So I don't want to skip over that. All of them require compliance. And again, that's another layer based on state, what compliance system the state has signed on to and is requiring these different entities to utilize. So I didn't want to skip over that, but hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. So let's talk about some of the very interesting comments that you made, and I was not even aware that, let's say, CBD is going to be related to the cannabis industry. So that's a very interesting finding, personally for me. So let's talk about how CBD is related to the, let's say, cannabis grower. Is that a byproduct of some of these leaves that they are trying to grow? Maybe talk about some of the plans, and then what are different products and what are the different industries that can benefit from growers. So the customer base, customer groups, different product and offerings.
Yeah, and so basically the CBD is a byproduct of the processing.
Okay.
And so, and along with that, I should mention that you've got the additional classification of hemp in there as well. There are a couple of states. I don't recall the number right off the top of my head, but there are a couple of states that have some regulatory compliance around hemp farms as well. And that's kind of a whole nother subset. I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not in that space. So, but it is another kind of subcomponent of what we're talking about here. But yeah, back to kind of the CBD and how that fits into the regulatory perspective. Some states, as I mentioned, are only focused on CBD sales. And I think from my perspective, the easiest way to kind of think of that is, it seems to be that was the entry point, if you will, for a state to start going down the legalization and compliance process.
Yeah.
So I would anticipate that as those states get more comfortable with the supply chain and the regulatory process of approving licenses and things like that, because as I'm sitting here talking, the one thing I did not mention, which again is very interesting to me when you get into this is why this business is so fascinating, to be perfectly honest, because there's so many layers of complexity, and this last layer of complexity that we didn't talk about. So you've got, obviously a state that will either legalize the medical and or recreational side of cannabis.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got all of the city and county compliance. So, just because your state has, passed the ordinances does not necessarily mean that you are in a city and a county that you can apply for licensure and operate one of these businesses.
Wow.
So again, just to kind of add to that complexity, and then, and then again, we talk about these layers, right? Each city typically has its own series of ordinances. So as you go through the licensure process, you're starting off. I'm in Michigan. So one of our cannabis clients it has applied for what's considered a Class C grow license, and that is basically the largest grow license that you can apply for. You can cultivate up to 2,000 plants, and there's
Okay.
some differences there, but basically, once the state pre-qualification happened, then the city qualification can then happen. So then you can apply to the city. And to my point, the city has an entire 20, 30, 40 page document that you are reading through to ensure compliance at the city level. So you've got, the state compliance, you've got the city and county compliance, and then once you obtain compliance at the city level, you can go back to the state level after you've done your build out, because they're going to have final inspections and kind of last say before you get your actual operating license in this grow facility in particular. So just to kind of add to some of those complexities at all of these different levels, you're talking about understanding the regulatory compliances
Yeah.
on top of just operating a business. So back to your point earlier about alcohol and tobacco and some of these other regulated industries, that is obviously where we take a huge sidestep away from kind of the similarities of manufacturing and really get into the cannabis space. And that to me, again, that's really what interested me about this business, because it is so intricate, and I'm
Yeah.
a details person. It's just so intricate. You really have to dot every I, cross every T, and run it through 12 spell checks. I mean, it's
Yeah.
crazy, but I love that part of it because it is very complex from that standpoint.
Okay, very interesting. So obviously, we are going to do a little bit of spell check for the manufacturing process. For the listeners who might not be familiar with that. So I know that there is a little bit of licensing structure. I don't know how these licenses are really structured. I don't know if they are going to be more in terms of the size, how many plants you can grow, because as we all know, these are very tricky plants. I mean, I don't think the city is going to allow these plants to grow in the residential area. Otherwise, neighbors are probably going to complain. So maybe you can touch a little bit on that.
Some of the states allow for what they call a caregiver system.
Okay.
And what's interesting about the caregiver system is that depending again on the licensing and requirements, um, you can, as an individual, operate under the Caregiver Act. At least again, here in Michigan, we have a Caregiver Act. I'm very familiar with that. Some of the other states, I'm not sure if they've adopted this as well, but this was more under the medical, which is what was passed early on in Michigan. I think that was passed, the medical side was passed, I think, in 2008, if I recall. But what I wanted to make the comment on there, Sam, is that under the Caregiver Act, you are actually allowed to grow up to, I believe the number is 12 plants. You're allowed to grow that basically on your personal property.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there's boxes to check with that,
Yeah.
correct,
Yeah. Yeah.
from a regulatory standpoint, but there is some allowance for things like that. And the other point to make in terms of what the cities will allow you to do, they do have what are classified as green zones, which basically is similar to like an alcohol or those type of establishments. There's a certain amount of space around these facilities that need to basically be clear of schools and churches and things like that. So they have put a little bit of that into it, but I thought it was kind of an interesting point to make about the caregiver system, just because you brought up on the residential side. And I don't think a lot of people would necessarily think that that is a component of all of this, but there again, it kind of ends up being another avenue to get into this space.
Very interesting. So let's talk about the manufacturing process now. So obviously you have the hemp, you have the CBD, and obviously I don't know if these plants, the plants that you are trying to grow, I don't know if they are going to be different, similar, same. I don't know the CBD oil is going to be the byproduct of if it is going to be a fruit or leaf. So do you want to describe, what all different ingredients that are being used in the manufacturing process? Are they all coming from your farm where you are trying to grow? And then, what kind of machines are used in the manufacturing process? So touch a little bit on the manufacturing process.
Yeah, it's interesting. So again, you've basically got two different entities that you're talking about. You've got the cultivation
Yeah.
side of things, which are going to be growing the plants,
Yeah.
right? So once you have grown the plants, you have two different ways that you can distribute that. You can then sell those products into a processing facility, which is then going to take those plants, the flower, if you will, and they're going to extract the CBD oil from those from the flower. So that is
Okay.
kind of one avenue.
Okay.
You can also, as a cultivator or grower, you can also sell into a dispensary or provisioning center. So
Okay.
in that case, you're actually taking the flower itself and putting that in for final packaging to be sold at retail. So those
Okay.
are kind of the two channels. But it's interesting again with this business because unless you have a large scale operation that is vertically integrated, and by that I mean you hold a license at each one of these entity levels, you are really working with channel partners if that's the best way, or
Yeah.
making that B2B sale to move your product. So it's interesting from the complexity of how those relationships work. And from a regulatory standpoint, again, you are limited on who is your customer in certain scenarios, because they want to control how that product goes from seed to sale. So the tracking happens throughout, but it is interesting to me to when you compare cannabis to maybe a traditional manufacturing facility or something like that. There's no compliance around who your customer can be in a manufacturing setting from a B2B or B2C space, versus in cannabis there is a very defined structure to get from seed to sale, and is very closely regulated, monitored, and controlled. So it's interesting.
Okay, very interesting. So I am a business guy. I only care for dollars. Right, Dave? You know me.
Yeah.
So so when you talk about the CBD oil, and I don't know what all applications are going to be there, but that seems like a very attractive product. Obviously, I don't know if there are going to be any medical applications, but obviously your flowers and the actual cannabis product that you have that are sold through dispensary, that's going to be significantly expensive as well. So is there a decision making involved in, if the flowers are not going to be as good, then that goes to your CBD oil, versus if it is going to be too good, then it actually becomes the CBD oil. So what is the decision making process there? What is qualified for the CBD oil and what is for the actual product?
That's a great question, and I don't think there's a real clearly defined answer with that, Sam, because it
Okay.
ends up, it's kind of, so you're dealing with cultivation, you're growing something, right?
Yeah.
It's a live crop, if you will, and so it's interesting because it's kind of, from my experience, driven by customer demand of what people are looking for. I know on the CBD, some of the things that become extraction are, obviously not going to be the premium products, the premium flower. It's going to be some of the, I don't want to say byproduct, but some of the flower that cannot be sold, whole. So, some of it is market demand, and some of it is kind of your go-to-market strategy, if you will,
Yeah.
in terms of how you want to operate your grow, and where you think you can bring value into the market. Because, in some sense, with so many people getting into this space, at some point there is going to be a more of a commodity type of product,
Yeah.
and then you're going to have more of a premium brand.
Yeah.
So it's really a strategy play to say, what am I trying to build? Am I trying to build a premium brand that is known in the industry for a specific end result, i.e., flower or, something else? Or am I going to try to go the volume route, if you will,
Yeah.
and kind of run it? I say run it to the end because we know what happens with commodities, right?
Yeah.
What happens? Price goes down,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
supply goes up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but it's interesting because obviously, from a consumer perspective, if you are growing a very in demand strain and a high quality product,
Yeah.
which is, the companies that I work with typically kind of seem to be in that camp. They are trying to go after the growing the widely recognized brand with the high quality products. Like I said, it's kind of a strategy decision from what my experience has been.
Okay, and from the macro perspective, let's say if you look at different businesses, I don't know which ones are doing well, which ones are not doing well, even though it's a very attractive market, but it again goes back to how you are running your business and how effectively you are running your business. So, in terms of the split, let's say if I go to, and I don't know how many growers are there, let's say in Michigan, I'm actually going to take an example. And I don't know if there are going to be any other factors that are going to be in play, whether you are going to be an oil business versus you are going to be the cannabis business. So, if you look at the percentage in terms of the growers, and let's say if you have 100 growers in Michigan, and you can correct me if there are going to be more than that. So out of 100, how many are really in the oil space? How many are in the actual cannabis space? What has been their decision making overall? Do they typically isolate? Do they typically diversify? Is there a yield percentage? So let's say if I have 2,000 different plants, how much oil can I get from the facility? Do you want to talk a little bit about the yield percentage and overall structure of the businesses?
Yeah, I think at a macro level, the easiest way to answer that is at the end of the day, it's still a business and they're trying to maximize revenue.
Yeah.
So what I'm really trying to say with that is the majority of the majority of growers are going to look at their crop and take the best of what they've got and try to, sell that directly to into a dispensary, into a provisioning place. And the balance of that is probably going to go to a processor. Now, one thing we didn't even talk about, which again I should mention, but you also have an entire edible market
Okay.
that we haven't even talked about. And
Yeah.
so again, that edible comes from the extraction of the oil. So they are taking that oil from the flower and introducing that into all different types. You have gummies, you have brownies and cookies and
Yeah.
candy. I mean, all just it's incredible what people are doing to introduce this into products, I guess is the best way to say it. So hopefully that answers your question, but everybody is looking to maximize revenue. And the other thing that you have to consider from a cultivation standpoint,
Yeah.
again, that we didn't really talk about, but I think is interesting, and it touches back to the compliance side of things. We're talking about living plants here, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes those living plants don't make it. And sometimes, there are issues inside of these grow facilities, whether it is different types of bugs infiltrating,
Yeah.
where it potentially they are losing entire crops or entire rooms, all of
Yeah.
these types of things. And what I find interesting is that depending on the size of the plants and the maturity level of the plants, when they get destroyed or when something like that happens, that's an event that basically gets tracked and triggered and tracked into the statewide compliance systems. And I think that part is interesting because just like the comment about trying to maximize from a revenue standpoint what
Yeah.
you're doing, you still have the consideration of that this is an agricultural business and there are factors, even though a lot of these grow operations happen indoor and climate controlled, and it's wild to see that side of it. You can still get bugs and contamination and
Yeah.
all types of things which ultimately impact it. And there again, will ultimately impact that sales side of it, because if you have a less desirable product,
Yeah.
you may have to go the route of selling to a processor or something like that to be able to still move whatever it is that you've got left. So it's again just another reason that this business is so fascinating.
Yeah, and that's a really good segue, to be honest. I mean, see, I really wanted to talk about these state compliance systems. I mean, cannabis grower facilities, when you look at them, it's not as simple as, hey, I've got my backyard and I'm going to buy a bunch of seeds and just start growing. It's not as easy as that, because you have to have that integration with your state backend system. And I don't know why they care to track the contamination and the productivity yield for a grower, because it's their money, it's not state money. They should not have any reason to do
Well,
that. So
I'll tell you why though. I
yeah.
mean, there's a perfectly logical explanation for why, because they want to make sure that those products, those plants plants don't end up in a non-regulated sales situation.
Okay.
So by tracking, the destruction of them and by tracking them at certain sizes, because again, you have to put them into the statewide monitoring system when they reach a certain size. And same thing, if they are being destroyed, they have to meet kind of certain metrics to be tracked as destroyed. But that's the real reason, is from a compliance perspective, they want to make sure that these plants don't kind of go missing in the, if you will, and make it into, make it into a sales situation. Because again, think about it from, again, and it's different between the medical versus recreational, but because medical passed first, a lot of it is carryover. So when you think about it from a medical perspective, it would be no different than, a drug that you're, that you're manufacturing. So you want to make sure, hey, I know that, we have dosed out X amount of, pills, let's say, if we're comparing it to this person, and be able to track that versus just, having kind of, the back room medicine being handed across the counter. So I do think that it is for good reason. But to your point, it is interesting that although it is the grower's money, I can even talk about that from a licensure standpoint. And I'll give you the perfect example. You are not allowed, at least again in Michigan, you are not allowed to move forward with a build out of your building until you get to a certain point in licensure.
Okay.
And I find that interesting because if myself as an investor, let's just say, I own a building, I feel very confident that I'm going to be able to secure a license in the statewide and city system. If I'm willing to risk hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in a build out, why would the city hold me back from that? So I think it's really interesting, just the control perspectives that they're putting in place. And although I would be willing to take that risk, let's say as an investor, the city is very clearly saying, don't even think about it, because I think it's interesting because I think what they're trying to do is say, is this really a partner that's following the rules and checking all of the boxes and doing what we need to do so we feel comfortable? Because from their standpoint, this is going to generate a lot of, revenue for them, a lot of tax money. And so I think they're kind of hedging bets on people and businesses, right, that are going to comply, because that is what makes their life way easier. Compliance and paying your taxes. So I just, for what it's worth, I felt like that was kind of an interesting kind of perspective or side topic to jump into.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting comment there. I was thinking the license is going to be only applicable in terms of, how many plants you are growing, and as long as you are reporting that, and as long as you are reporting how many of them are really wasted and how much yield that you really had from those plants, as long as you are reporting that, you are going to be okay. But you made a very interesting comment there. These plants are being tracked and the plants are not going to disappear. So do they have some sort of serial number for each of the plants? And do they have are you serious? Like they have some sort of RFID or tracking for the plants?
That is exactly it. It's so there are three. I'll say there are three major compliance tracking systems. So it again, this is very interesting from my perspective, from a systems perspective, because each state is allowed to adopt a compliance tracking system. So the largest, the leader, if you will, in terms of number of states is called Metric, metric system. And so they have 16 states currently that they are responsible for, or that, they administer the tracking system. Now, what's interesting about Metric is it started off as an RFID tracking company. So they have a long history in RFID, and obviously cannabis is relatively new. But they have been the market leader because I would say ease of use, how they've positioned themselves, and their experience in the chain of custody space. And again, we talk about carryovers, right? So one of my manufacturing facilities I was responsible for, we actually were creating, if you will, this was a print manufacturing company. We created all of the medical chain of custody multi-part documents that were used in one of the largest lab testing facilities in the world.
Yeah.
So, I'm very versed in chain of custody documentation and what it takes to ensure compliance in that space. And so Metric, because of their history in RFID and chain of custody, they have really become kind of the market leader. The other two, one is called BioTrack,
Yeah.
and the other one is called Leaf. And BioTrack has, at last count, 9 states, and Leaf is kind of the newest player. I say newest because they only have 3 states. And what is interesting about BioTrack and Leaf as compared to Metric
Yeah.
is the fact that they also offer, and you're going to love this, they also offer what you and I would affectionately call ERP.
Oh, wow.
They market it different. They market it as seed to sale
Yeah.
software, but that's really what they're trying to position. I think it's an interesting play where a company that is trying to go after a government customer, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the state. They are also trying to speak to the business level and say that, well, we have full integration.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, they also have full integration, according to their websites, with the metric system. So Metric has positioned themselves as the go-to for government. They are, a state is their customer.
Okay.
As a grower, as a lab testing facility, as a dispensary, as a delivery company, we have to interface with that metric system, but we would not be their customer. So it's very clearly defined when you start to look at the metric system as compared to these others, who their target audience is, and kind of shows with the number of states that they've been able to get signed up. So long term, I believe it's going to be something to keep an eye on and watch.
Yeah.
As far as who ultimately, what happens on the merger and acquisition side, because I think, there's obviously a play there. Somebody will come out and remain leader as the rest of the states, kind of continue on this path. And I believe that they will. I do believe at some point this will be fully legalized. And I think have been seeing the steps towards that for, many years across many states. So.
Okay, amazing. So let's talk a little bit about the distribution and the warehousing side, of the things as well. So if you look at, let's say, the alcohol industry, there are some countries and the states that are going to be slightly more regulated than the other. For example, let's say if you talk about Ontario in Canada, they are going to have very different regulations for alcohol. And I don't know if cannabis in Michigan right now is going to be comparable to something in Canada because it's slightly more regulated. So typically in the alcohol industry, what you are not going to be able to do is, unless you have the consumer for the product registered. Okay. So in Ontario, they don't really release the product so the custody is going to be with the LCBO in Ontario. The US is slightly more liberal overall in the release of the product. So the company that actually owns the inventory, they can actually warehouse in their warehouse, and they don't even have to mention who's drinking the alcohol. Anybody can do that, but that's not cool in Ontario. Okay. So how's the cannabis market? Are they tracking who's actually buying? And do they have the end-to-end traceability of the consumer? Who is responsible for the inventory in the cannabis market?
Yeah, the inventory, that's a great question. The inventory changes hands. So think about it from the chain of custody perspective, at every transaction, it is tracked. So when that product, it's even tracked in the transportation phase.
Yeah.
So when it moves from grow or cultivation to dispensary, it's obviously given to a secure transporter. That secure transporter is tracked the transfer in the metric system in Michigan. Again, we're talking about Michigan as a metric system state. So in metric, that would be tracked in terms of those plants. So those serial number of plants being given from a chain of custody perspective to a secure transporter. The secure transporter would then have those logged into their system. and vice versa. So every touch point is tracked. The other part that's tracked from a retail perspective or consumer perspective is when you go into a dispensary, you have to give them your driver's license.
Yeah.
That is all tracked. All of those sales are tracked, and so that therefore they complete the chain of custody. So they are very, because that company started off in chain of custody and RFID. I believe that it made it very easy for the states to go with them because they have the system in place to be able to do the transfers and the handshakes, if you will, between all of these different touch points, where some of the newer companies, I would say, are having to recreate that, which is why I believe they're also trying to go kind of dual purpose, because one, they see the need on the operations side. And in my opinion, that is probably easier to deal with than it is on the compliance side, chain of custody. Just again, having my chain of custody knowledge and knowing what you have to do to ensure compliance in that, there aren't any, kind of what we were talking about before in terms of, potentially having to destroy a number of plants. There are no places to hide in real chain of custody situations. You know exactly where that, seed came from.
Yeah.
And at every touch point and every growth stage or milestone, however you'd like to determine it, you know what's happened and where it's at. So there's full visibility across it.
Amazing. This is so fascinating. So that's it for today. Dave, do you have any last minute closing thoughts or remarks for our listeners?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. This was a great conversation, by the way, so I really appreciated it. To your point, cannabis is a very fascinating business for a lot of reasons. Number one, people are attracted to it because the potential to generate revenue and significant profits are very attractive for people. The thing that I would leave with in regards to cannabis and, getting into this space is that it can be very easy to be misled. It can be very easy to find yourself in a partner type situation when you're seeking professional guidance.
Yeah.
So for example, during the licensure process, there are a lot of people in the marketplace that say that they can help you with licensure and compliance. You want to be asking the right questions. You want to make sure that you understand the process that you're about to embark on and what all of those different stages of that process are. You don't necessarily have to know how to fill out the documentation and things like that, but you have to understand at a really high level what is expected, because you, as the person or entity seeking licensure, there are a lot of hurdles to cross from a paperwork and providing documentation standpoint. So you want to be mindful and understand, because there are a lot of people that could be out there saying, yes, 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 I can help you, I can help you. And all the while you're spending thousands and in some cases tens of thousands of dollars and not moving forward in that process. So that's kind of number one thing I would share. The second thing I would share is along the same lines, but different. From an operational perspective, there's no doubt that you are going to need process documentation and systems within your business, not only to ensure compliance, but to run a efficient operation.
Yeah.
When you are in the process of seeking out some of these seed to sale systems, make sure that you are asking appropriate questions that relate to how your grower in that particular case or in your lab testing facility, make sure that those seed to sale systems are really addressing some of the operational inefficiencies and operational challenges that you already have. Because there again, you can go down a path of taking on a product, taking on a system implementation, and ultimately being in a place 6 months, a year, 18 months from now, where you don't have a system that will connect to Metric or to, one of the other systems. Everybody says they can do it, but those are the types of things to be mindful of. There is a lot of opportunity for people to take advantage of you when you are not very educated in terms of the infrastructure that you need to have in place to move forward in this business. And Those would be my two things to really be mindful of for somebody. Really, really make sure that you're asking the right questions and, really engage with people on a relationship standpoint so you understand exactly what they can do to help you, whether it's for a licensure or whether it's from an operational standpoint. Really understand what they can help you do before you commit with a contract or anything else, because a lot of people in this space, again, are very happy to sign a contract with you that locks you into something, and you may or may not be very pleased with yourself once you learn a little bit more.
Yeah, and my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be, obviously, this is going to be a tremendous opportunity for businesses or people who are going after it, because obviously it's a new market. There's a lot of opportunity. It's probably going to be an industry in itself, and it probably already is. But at the same time, it is going to be one of the most complex industry. So make sure you really understand what you are getting into. I know everybody wants to run after money, but at the same time, you still need to understand the intricacies and the compliance and the legal risk and the financial risk. So make sure you understand that. On that note, Dave, I really want to thank you for your time. This was a very powerful episode.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sam. Really appreciate it.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Dave, head over to thechrysler.club. It's THECRYSLER.CLUB. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Nelson Abreu from 3050 Imports, who discusses the wine distribution, businesses nuances, and supply chain challenges. Also, the interview with Aman Elani from Sahol Cold Brew, who discusses the unique challenges and important metrics for a consumer brand and a food and beverage company. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.